Today is day 4 for the Come Follow Me study for this week, November 24th through the 30th. He has sealed his mission and his works with his own blood. Doctrine and Covenants 135 through 136. Thursday, November 27th, 2025. Doctrine and Covenants 136, 1 through 16. Section 136, Organization of the Camp of Zion. Since at least 1844, church leaders have been actively planning for a possible move west. The prophet Joseph Smith and other church leaders sensed the growing hostility toward the church in Illinois and recognized that they might have to leave the state. Under Joseph's direction, the Quorum of the 12 Apostles in February 1844 began secretly planning for an expedition to western North America to look for possible gathering places. Shortly thereafter, the prophet formed a new organization, known as the Council of 50, and charged it with finding a new home for the saints in the West. Near the end of his life, the prophet Joseph committed the priesthood keys of this dispensation to the members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. With the death of the prophet Joseph Smith, the leadership of the church fell on the Quorum of the 12. Brigham Young, as the senior apostle, was president of the quorum. After the prophet's martyrdom, during a meeting held on August 8, 1844, many church members received a spiritual manifestation confirming to them that Brigham Young, who was president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, was to lead the church. The opposition from enemies of the church that led to the martyrdom was not stilled with the death of the prophet. Once again, mobs began to persecute the saints. Many enemies of the church thought that once the prophet Joseph Smith was killed, the church would collapse. However, when the church and the city of Nauvoo continued to grow and prosper, enemies of the church increased their efforts to drive church members from Illinois. In September 1845, Colonel Levi Williams, one of those indicted for the murders of Joseph and Hiram Smith, but later acquitted, led a mob of 300 men and systematically burned outlying Mormon farms and homes. They torched many unprotected homes, farm buildings, mills, and grain stacks. Many Illinois residents were afraid that the presence of the Latter-day Saints in their state would lead to a civil war and asked church members to leave the state. President Joseph Fielding Smith said, "The Carthage Convention, on the 1st and 2nd of October, 1845, another convention of citizens from 9 counties adjacent to Hancock, was led at Carthage. Resolutions were adopted in which the Mormons were accused of depredations upon the persons and property of other citizens of Hancock County, and adjudged guilty in spite of the personal investigation of the governor himself, unfriendly to the Latter-day Saints. Much bitterness of spirit was manifested at this meeting, which decided that it was too late to settle any difficulties between the Mormons and the other inhabitants, and only one thing would suffice, and that was the removal of the Mormons from the state. They declared that the Mormons were not being persecuted, but were suffering from their dishonest acts. At the same time, they declared that from long acquaintance with the old citizens of Hancock County, they could vouch for their honor, integrity, and strict observance of the laws of their country. Notwithstanding, it was universally known that these same citizens had taken part in the assassination of Joseph and Hiram Smith by mob force and contrary to law. Moreover, that these same law-abiding citizens burned their houses to the ground, had forced them from their fields where they had gone to gather crops, had whipped their men and stolen their cattle without any protest. It appeared that the old citizens, like the king, could do no wrong if their deprivations were committed against the Latter-day Saints. A most regrettable feature in connection with these troubles is the fact that O.H. Browning, Stephen A. Douglas, and others, who had defended the prophet Joseph Smith, now gave their influence to the mob and assisted in bringing to pass the expulsion of the Mormon people from Illinois. Bitter feelings against the saints increased. Judges were intimidated, and even the officials of the state dared not raise a voice in protest above a whisper, or invoke the majesty of the law. President Young pressed forward with plans first initiated by the prophet Joseph to take the saints to the Rocky Mountains, where they could find some measure of peace. On September 24, 1845, the Quorum of the 12 Apostles published a letter promising that the church would leave the following spring. President Joseph Fielding Smith continued preparations to leave Ohio. During the fall and winter months, preparations went steadily on for the removal of the entire body of the Latter-day Saints in the spring. Work on the temple continued with increased diligence, as if there were no thought of a removal, until that structure was completed. January 1st, 1846, the work of finishing the assembly room for dedication was nearing completion. The General Conference of the Church was held in the building in October 1845. according to the commandment of the Lord through Joseph Smith in October 1841. In December, the ordnance work in the temple was commenced, and thereafter the building was occupied both day and night to afford the saints the opportunity to receive their endowments. This continued until most all of the saints had departed on their westward journey. May 1st, 1861, after the majority of the people had departed from the city, the temple was publicly dedicated in the presence of about 300 persons. In the meantime, every available building in Nauvoo had been converted into a shop where wagons, harnesses, and other necessary articles could be manufactured for the journey. The timber for the wagons was cut and brought to Nauvoo, where it was prepared and boiled in salt and water or kiln dried. Teams were sent to various parts of the country to procure iron, and blacksmiths, wheelwrights, carpenters, and other workmen were kept busy night and day. There was very little sale of property because of the opposition of the citizens of the county, who used their influence to discourage sales by making threats against the new settlers as well as harassing the saints. In February 1846, under the direction of the 12, and under threats of violence from local mobs and the state militia, church members began leaving Nauvoo, journeying west across the state of Iowa. President Joseph Fielding Smith continued the abandonment of Nauvoo. Wednesday, February 4th, 1846, the first of the saints left Nauvoo and crossed the Mississippi River on the journey to the west. On the 6th of February, Bishop George Miller and a company of 6 wagons crossed the river, and a few days later the work of ferrying the saints to the Iowa side was kept up day and night. Elder Parley P. Pratt left Nauvoo on the 14th of February, and the following day President Brigham Young, Willard Richards, and George A. Smith, with a large company of saints, crossed the Mississippi on the ice and continued their journey about 9 miles to Sugar Creek in Lee County, where a temporary camp was formed for the exiles fleeing from Nauvoo. Because of extensive rain and insufficient supplies, church members who left Nauvoo in February 1846 spent over 3.5 months making the 300-mile journey across Iowa. President Joseph Fielding Smith continued. The journey resumed. March 1st, 1846, camp was broken and the journey was resumed. The weather was extremely cold and stormy, and a great number of people were without proper clothing and necessary shelter. Many of the wagons were without covers, and others had covers which would not shed the rain. Several members of the camps died from exposure and lack of proper care. The roads were almost impassable because of the constant storms. At this time, there were some 400 wagons on the road, heavily laden and without sufficient teams to permit of rapid travel. In this condition, the exiles continued their toilsome journey over the plains of Iowa. Elder Gerald N. Lund said, Brigham Young left Nauvoo in mid-February of 1846. It took them 130 days, 4 months, to reach winter quarters. Those who didn't leave in February, but waited until May, made the same journey in about 3 weeks. Why didn't the Lord say, Brigham, if you leave in February, the rains are going to come, and the roads are going to be one huge bog. So just wait until May. You'll go so much faster. But no, in February, Brigham was out there leading that group on their muddy trek. In fact, I love Brigham's sense of humor. In his history, he records that they only hit one mud hole, but it was 6 miles long. And that's the way it was. President Joseph Fielding Smith said, at the Missouri River, on the 14th of June, President Young, Heber C. Kimball, Parley P. Pratt, and others arrived on the banks of the Missouri, not far from Council Bluffs, with their respective companies. The next day, a council meeting was held, and it was decided to move back on to the bluffs where spring water could be obtained, and they would be protected from Indians. The Potawatomi Indians were very friendly, and their chiefs showed the saints some favor. A ferry boat was built, and on the 29th the companies commenced crossing the river. About this time, Elder Wilford Woodruff, who had just returned from presiding over the British mission, and Elder Orson Hyde, who had been laboring in Nauvoo, joined the camp. President Young was still very anxious to send an exploring company to the Rocky Mountains in advance. The camps were called together, there being about 500 wagons on the ground and others on the way, and President Young addressed them, advising them of his desire to get a company off for the Rocky Mountains. He feared, he said, that something would happen to stop the movement, and was impressed that everything that men and hell could invent would be hatched up to prevent the camp from making any progress. He spoke plainly on the subject and said if the members of the church should be blown to the four winds and never gathered again, he wished them to remember that he had told them when and where to gather, and if they failed to do so, to remember and bear him witness in the day of judgment that they had received such information and advice. During this time, more than 500 Latter-day Saint men, who became known as the Mormon Battalion, heeded the call of President Brigham Young to enlist in the United States Army to serve during the Mexican War, which had begun in May 1846. Some of the men were joined by their wives and children. Their service would earn money to help poor church members make the journey west, but many families were left without husbands and fathers for part of their westward journey. For these reasons, church leaders determined not to continue west to the Rocky Mountains until the spring of 1847, and counseled church members to stay in temporary settlements for the winter. President Joseph Fielding Smith continued. Mormon Battalion, June 26, 1846. Captain James Allen of the United States Army arrived at Mount Pisgah and had an interview with the brethren there. He was the bearer of a message to the Mormon people, making a requisition on the camps for 4 or 5 companies of men to serve as volunteers in the war with Mexico, which had recently been declared. The brethren at Mount Pisgah did not feel authorized to take any action, and therefore advised Captain Allen to visit President Young and the apostles at Council Bluffs. Captain Allen arrived at Council Bluffs on the 30th day of June, and the following day met with the church authorities and presented his credentials for raising 500 men. Such a demand caused some surprise and a little dismay among the camps. However, President Brigham Young declared that the volunteers would be forthcoming. It was moved by Heber C. Kimball and seconded by Willard Richards that a battalion of 500 men be raised, which was carried unanimously at a meeting of the brethren of the camp, who were called together to consider the requisition. Consequently, President Young and Elder Kimball returned to Mount Pisgah to raise volunteers, while leaders were sent to Garden Grove and to Nauvoo bearing on the subject. Monday, July 13, 1846, in obedience to the call of the authorities, the camps of the saints met in Mosquito Creek, where they were addressed by President Young, Captain Allen, and Colonel Thomas L. Kane, who had arrived in camp to be of service to the people. 4 companies of the battalion were raised on that and the following day, and the 5th company a few days later. As they moved west across Iowa, they established camps for those who would follow. The winter of 1846 to 47 was spent at winter quarters, which today is Florence, Nebraska. President Joseph Fielding Smith continued. Winter quarters. The call of these able-bodied men for the battalion made it impossible for the saints in their weakened condition to continue their journey towards the west. It became necessary, therefore, for them to seek quarters where they could prepare for the coming winter. Captain James Allen secured from the chiefs representing the Potawatomi tribes their voluntary consent for the saints to make the Indian lands an abiding place as long as they should remain in that country. He also wrote an open letter stating what he had done in this matter. The Indian sub-agent also endorsed the letter, which Colonel Thomas L. Kane forwarded with a communication of his own to the President of the United States. Measures were taken to gather to this place all the scattered saints who were on the plains. 12 men were chosen to form a high council, and a site was chosen on the west bank of the Missouri River for their settlement. A committee of 12 men was appointed to arrange the temporary city into wards, over which bishops were chosen to preside. During the summer, hay was cut in sufficient quantities to provide for their stock in the winter. Every family labored diligently to construct some kind of a house in which they could find shelter, although many of these were merely dugouts built in the side of a hill. The place was named Winter Quarters and was laid out regularly into streets. The Indians gave some trouble, and it became necessary to build a stockade around the town. Through kind treatment, President Young and the saints obtained the goodwill of most of the Indians, so they lived in comparative peace. Mob uprisings in Nauvoo. In the summer of 1846, hostilities were renewed against the members of the church who still remained in Nauvoo. The great body of the saints had left, and many a remnant remained, composed of the poor, sick, and afflicted, who had been unable to get away. They were all anxious to depart, and were exerting all their energies to obtain means for that purpose. President Young and the apostles also were doing all in their power to aid them to depart. Notwithstanding their straitened circumstances and their inability to move, which was due mainly to mob violence they had suffered, their enemies became impatient at their delay and continued their vicious persecution. A number of settlements of saints stretched along both sides of the Missouri River. The largest settlement, Winter Quarters, was on the west side, in Nebraska. It quickly became home to approximately 3,500 church members who lived in houses of logs and in dugouts of willows and dirt. Many people were inadequately sheltered from the cold weather. Diseases such as malaria, pneumonia, tuberculosis, cholera, and scurvy resulted in widespread suffering and death. More than 700 church members died that first winter. Brian Richards said, at Winter Quarters, Brigham Young was not the president of the church. He was the president of the Quorum of the 12. However, since the 12 were the governing quorum of the church at that time, Brother Brigham was essentially the president of the church. Still, the first presidency had not yet been reorganized. 3.5 years would transpire between the death of Joseph Smith and the ordination of Brigham Young as the president of the high priesthood. In January 1847, Brigham Young prayed for the Lord's direction regarding the immigration to the West, and then dictated the inspired counsel that is recorded in Doctrine and Covenants 136. President Brigham Young received the revelation recorded in Doctrine and Covenants 136 at Winter Quarters, Nebraska, in January 1847. In it, the Lord counseled the saints to organize themselves and prepare for their journey west. Elder B.H. Roberts explained the serious business of preparing for the continuation of the march into the wilderness. The completion of the exodus from the United States was not neglected. It was considered in many council meetings of the presiding authorities. It was the chief topic of conversation and of discussion wherever 2 or 3 were gathered together. Thought upon it finally so crystallized in the mind of Brigham Young that on the 14th of January, 1847, at Winter Quarters, he was prepared to announce the word and will of the Lord upon the march of the camps of Israel to the west. February 4th, 1846, the first company of saints left Nauvoo, Illinois, on their trek west. June 1846, Brigham Young's company of saints arrived at the Missouri River, where Canesville, Iowa, Winter Quarters, Nebraska, and other settlements were eventually established. January 14th, 1847, Doctrine and Covenants 136 was received. July 24th, 1847, Brigham Young's Pioneer Company arrived in the Salt Lake Valley. Richard E. Bennett said, the matter of reestablishing the first presidency had weighed heavily on the 12 for several months, particularly during the trek to the Salt Lake Valley. As president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, Brigham Young felt impressed that the time had come to reestablish the first presidency. After several months of discussing the matter, 9 of the 12 apostles, Elders Parley P. Pratt and John Taylor, were in the Salt Lake Valley, and Elder Lyman Wright was in Texas, gathered at the home of Elder Orson Hyde near Miller's Hollow on the Iowa side of the Missouri. There, on the 5th of December, 1847, their deliberations culminated in the prayerful action of sustaining Brigham Young as president of the church, with Elders Heber C. Kimball and Willard Richards, both of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, as President Young's counselors. Section 136, the Word and Will of the Lord, given through President Brigham Young at Winter Quarters, the Camp of Israel, Omaha Nation, on the west bank of the Missouri River, near Council Bluffs, Iowa. Read Doctrine and Covenants 136, 1 through 33, looking for the Lord's counsel regarding how church members were to organize themselves and prepare to continue their journey west. By helping the saints remember that their conduct on the journey was as important as their destination, the revelation helped transform the westward migration from an unfortunate necessity into an important shared spiritual experience. Keep this in mind as you study Section 136. What counsel do you find that could help turn a difficult trial in your life into an important spiritual experience? You might ponder how this counsel can help you accomplish the Lord's will in your own life, as it helped the early saints in their travels. The exiled Latter-day Saints were referred to as the Camp of Israel, the name used anciently for the children of Israel who were led by Moses out of Egypt. The deliberate use of this name suggested that modern Israel could be blessed during its journey through the wilderness and eventually be led to a permanent home, just as ancient Israel had been. To the church members in Winter Quarters, Nebraska, the Lord declared himself to be the Lord your God, even the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, and of Isaac, and of Jacob. The same God who led the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, and he promised that his arm would be stretched out in the last days to save his people, Israel. The inspired pattern by which the saints were to organize themselves for the migration was similar to the organization and leadership implemented by ancient Israel. How the camp of Israel is to be organized for the westward journey is explained. Doctrine and Covenants 136, 1 through 3. The word and will of the Lord concerning the camp of Israel in their journeyings to the west. Let all the people of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and those who journey with them be organized into companies with a covenant and promise to keep all the commandments and statutes of the Lord our God. Let the companies be organized with captains of hundreds, captains of fifties, and captains of tens, with a president and his 2 counselors at their head, under the direction of the 12 apostles. Smith and Shodal wrote, the saints were driven from their homes in Nauvoo under the most trying circumstances and in poverty and destitution in large measure, for they had been robbed by their enemies. Therefore, it was extremely needful for a revelation from the Lord for their guidance in their journeyings to the Rocky Mountains. The Lord did not fail them in this hour of distress, and gave this revelation to President Brigham Young to guide them in their journeyings and admonishing them to keep his commandments. All the members of the church were to be organized in companies, and were required to keep the commandments faithfully, that they might have the guidance of his Spirit with them in all their trying circumstances. These companies from Kirtland to Missouri, with captains over hundreds, fifties, and tens, and all under the direction of the Council of Apostles. Doctrine and Covenants 136, 4. And this shall be our covenant, that we will walk in all the ordinances of the Lord. Elder Brewster McConkie said, to remember and keep the covenants is a standing obligation resting upon the Lord's people. Nothing is ever appointed or required of any of the saints which is contrary to the church covenants. All gospel teaching is to be according to the covenants. Those who keep their covenants have the Lord's promise, given with an immutable covenant, that all things shall work together for their good. Every member of the church should subscribe, without any mental reservation whatever, to this revealed statement, and this shall be our covenant, that we will walk in all the ordinances of the Lord. Smith and Shodal wrote, how essential it was then in the days of tribulation for the saints to walk by covenant as they journeyed towards a new home. Moreover, it was necessary that they provide themselves the best they could with teams, clothing, and provisions, for the journey was a difficult one. Some members of necessity would be left behind until such time as they could be prepared. The officers of the companies were to decide who might go, and who would better remain behind until a more suitable day. These who were to remain were to put in crops and wait until the coming harvest. Each company was to bear an equal portion of the means for the benefit of all. Those who had substance were to share with those who were destitute in the true spirit of charity and faith. There were among them the widows and fatherless, and the wives and families of those who had gone into the Mormon battalion. If they would do this, the Lord would pour out upon them his blessings. They should have flocks and herds, and their fields would not fail them. President Gordon B. Hinckley said, we are a covenant people. I have had the feeling that if we could just encourage our people to live by 3 or 4 covenants, everything else would take care of itself. We would not have to have anything else except to go forward with our program. Think of the covenants of the temple. Sacrifice, the willingness to sacrifice for this, the Lord's work, and inherent in that law of sacrifice is the very essence of the atonement. the ultimate sacrifice made by the Son of God in behalf of each of us. Consecration, which is associated with it, a willingness to give everything, if need be, to help in the unrolling of this great work, and a covenant of love and loyalty one to another in the bonds of marriage, fidelity, chastity, morality. If our people could only learn to live by these covenants, everything else would take care of itself. I am satisfied. We would not have to worry about sacrament meeting attendance. We would not have to worry about willingness to serve missions. We would not have to worry about divorce and the many requests for cancellation of temple ceilings. We would not have to worry about any of those things. Doctrine and Covenants 136, 5-7. Let each company provide themselves with all the teams, wagons, provisions, clothing, and other necessities for the journey that they can. When the companies are organized, let them go with their might to prepare for those who are to tarry. Let each company with their captains and presidents decide how many can go next spring, then choose out a sufficient number of able-bodied and expert men to take teams, seeds, and farming utensils, to go as pioneers to prepare for putting in spring crops. Since not all church members were able to begin the journey west at the same time, those who went on ahead were to go too with their might to prepare for those who were to tarry, or who would come later, by putting in spring crops and preparing houses and fields for raising grain. The Lord called these saints pioneers, meaning that they were to help others by going before them and preparing the way for them to follow. After a few church leaders left on April 5th, 1847, the first company of pioneers left winter quarters on April 15th. President Gordon B. Hinckley said, on April 5th, the Pioneer Company started west. It consisted of 143 men, 3 women, and 2 children, with Brigham Young leading the group. Fortunately, when they had gone only a short distance, Apostles Parley P. Pratt and John Taylor arrived at winter quarters from England. They brought with them barometers, sextants, telescopes, and other instruments. In the hands of Orson Pratt, an accomplished scientist, these made it possible for the pioneers to determine the latitude, longitude, temperature, and elevation above sea level of their position each day. Such information was invaluable in the preparation for a guide for those who were to come later. They traveled more than 1,000 miles and arrived in the Salt Lake Valley in late July 1847. On July 24, 1847, President Brigham Young entered the valley and received confirmation that the saints had found their new home. More than 60,000 people eventually walked the same trail to gather with the saints in the Utah area before the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869. President Thomas S. Monson explained how church members today can be pioneers. To be a Latter-day Saint is to be a pioneer, for the definition of a pioneer is one who goes before to prepare or open up the way for others to follow. And to be a pioneer is to become acquainted with sacrifice. Members of the church often must leave behind old habits, long-time customs, and cherished friends. Some make the agonizing decision to leave behind family members who oppose their church membership. Latter-day Saints move forward, however, praying that precious ones will yet understand and accept. The path of a pioneer is not easy, for we follow in the footsteps of the ultimate pioneer, even the Savior, who went before, showing us the way to follow. Consider those who have sacrificed to prepare the way for you to enjoy the blessings of the restored gospel. What will you do to help others receive the blessings of the gospel? Doctrine and Covenants 136:8. Let each company bear an equal proportion according to the dividend of their property, in taking the poor, the widows, the fatherless, and the families of those who have gone into the army, that the cries of the widow and the fatherless come not up into the ears of the Lord against this people. President Dallin H. Oaks said, when the saints were driven out of Missouri, many were so poor that they lacked teams and wagons to move. Their church leaders were adamant that none of the poor would be left behind. The response was the same as in the exodus from Nauvoo. At a conference of the church in October 1845, the membership entered into a covenant to take all the saints with them. Thereafter, in the initial epic struggle across Iowa, the companies that arrived first at their stopping place on the Missouri River sent rescue wagons back toward Nauvoo to gather those who had been too poor to leave earlier. The revelation that guided the next exodus on the trip west directed each company to bear an equal proportion in taking the poor, the widows, the fatherless, and the families of those who had gone into the army. When the wagons and handcarts moved west, no day's journey ended until every straggler was accounted for. When the saints settled in the valleys of the mountains, they promptly established a perpetual immigrating fund to assist the poor to move from winter quarters, and later from the nations of Europe. At least half of those who journeyed to join the saints would not have come without the help of leaders and members who were determined to include everyone who desired to gather to Zion. Doctrine and Covenants 136, 9 through 16. Let each company prepare houses and fields for raising grain, for those who are to remain behind this season. And this is the will of the Lord concerning his people. Let every man use all his influence and property to remove this people to the place where the Lord shall locate a stake of Zion. And if ye do this with a pure heart and all faithfulness, ye shall be blessed. You shall be blessed in your flocks, and in your herds, and in your fields, and in your houses, and in your families. Let my servants Ezra T. Benson and Erastus Snow organize a company, and let my servants Orson Pratt and Wilford Woodruff organize a company. Also let my servants Amasa Lyman and George A. Smith organize a company, and appoint presidents and captains of hundreds and of fifties and of tens. And let my servants that have been appointed go and teach this my will to the saints, that they may be ready to go to a land of peace.